how and for what purposes, for what purpose the asset is going to be used. It can also be the case that although there is an identified asset, you also have a contract to procure the full benefit from that asset, but you do not have the right to decide how that asset is going to be used. We will see in the coming slides. I have one example for you which will make it more clearer that what exactly I mean, but then in that case also it's a service contract. So no, then it will go to a service contract. The other thing is like, okay, if neither the lessor nor the lessee is defining that how and for what purpose this asset is going to be used, and it's already predetermined in the contract, then what? Okay, whether you will decide this to classify this as a lease contract or a service contract, then you have to ask two more questions. First thing is, does the customer operate the asset? If answer is yes, then it's a lease contract. If answer is no, then the last question. Unfortunately, too many steps, but yeah, as I said, it's one of the most debatable topic, which I think like ISP has to somehow address in this standard. Yeah. So the last question which you have to ask is, if it's of a specialized design that already defines that whoever operates the asset is in the benefit of the lessee or benefit of the customer, then again it's a lease. Okay. So far clear? Okay. So what is the concept of an identified asset here? So as I said, yeah, if for instance in the contract the vehicle number or the vehicle type is not mentioned, then what? What will you do as an accountant to decide if it's a lease contract or not? Okay. Then there are certain parameters which are laid down in IFRS 16 which somehow help us to decide whether there is an identified asset or not, and those are basically that if the lessor has the substantive rights to replace that asset at any point of time. Yeah, if that is the case, then it's a service contract. It's not a lease contract. If the replacement rights are not substantive, then these are somehow a lease contract. And what are the different things which we have to assess as an accountant to see if the rights are substantive or not? Yeah. For instance, if there is a practical ability for the lessor to change the asset, if it has only one vehicle or one aircraft, then whatever you write in the contract, it becomes completely irrelevant. Okay. Second thing is it really beneficial for the lessor or the supplier to change the asset? For example, if you have in one remote location on an oil rig, a rig which is operating for an oil exploration company, I think it does not make sense for the lessor to replace it very often. Again, it's a practical ability to replace the asset will be somehow not justifiable. And also, like if there are big replacement costs or other practical reasons, yeah. So there are many parameters which ISP has laid down in IFRS 16 to determine if the substitutive rights are substantive or not. Okay. So if the substitutive rights are substantive, then it's not a lease contract. Okay. Sometime in a classic lease contract, you have some rights. Yeah. For example, you can say, okay, the lessor will be able to replace the asset, for example, when a maintenance is required. For example, in the aviation industry, sometimes the aircraft requires heavy maintenance after 3 years. Yeah, so aircraft will not be available for a couple of weeks or whatever. Yeah, so in that case, if a replacement aircraft is provided, this is more like it's not a replacement of asset. It's just like replacement for a small period of time, just to somehow upgrade or make the real asset in a usable form. Yeah, so this is not considered as a somehow substitutive right. Sometimes it can also happen that the supplier or a lessor has a protective right. For instance, it says, yeah, that you cannot take this vehicle out of Pakistan, or you cannot drive this off-road, or these kind of things. These are more like protective rights rather than substitutive rights. Okay, so we have to be very careful. Yeah, so protective rights are more which are somehow laid down to protect the asset, and substitutive rights are more to make the lessor or the supplier flexible enough to benefit from the replacement of the asset. Yeah. So this is something we have to keep in mind. And one good example which has been laid down in the basis of conclusion for IFRS 16 was like, for example, if a coffee shop enters into a contract with the with the airport, that they will have a counter on any of the entrances, and the space is somehow laid down that it will be like 2 meter space or whatever, but it's not really marked that on which entrance this space is gonna be. So in this case, the airport authorities can benefit from shifting the coffee stall from one entrance to another entrance. For instance, I come here and I say, okay, I want to build my counter here, I'm gonna pay you double price. Then the airport authority has the flexibility to shift that coffee counter to another entrance, yeah, because the contract says that this has to be on some entrance, yeah. It has not really specified that it has to be on the international lounge and this place and that. So this is something, it's a good example that in this case the substitution rights are substantive. The airport authority does not have to get your approval to change the location of the shop. So far with me? Okay, so just the repetition of what I have just said, that to establish that who basically has the right to use the control of the asset, I'm again repeating the use, yeah, so basically the use is very, very important. You can only benefit from the use of an asset, not just by physical control of an asset, yeah. So the economic benefit is generated by the use of an asset. Okay, so if the lessee or the customer has the right to direct how and for what purposes the asset is going to be used, then this is considered good enough to establish this as a lease contract with an identified asset. Okay, and if this use is already predefined or predetermined in the contract, then you have to ask the same two questions which we have seen in the previous decision tree. Remember? Yes, no? Okay. Entity has the right to operate the asset, or entity has, or the lessee has designed the asset. Okay, so these are the two things which we have to keep in mind while establishing that who is controlling the use of the asset. Yeah? So in all these scenarios, it will end up into a lease contract because there is an identified asset. This is a very, very important aspect, very, very important aspect. It can really go nasty when you go to the practical life. It can really go nasty. Okay, so when auditors, they want to assess that who's controlling the asset, they try to ask you different questions. Yeah. Who's deciding the route, for instance, in the aviation industry? Who is deciding what type of cargo is going to be loaded? Who is deciding what time the flight is going to land, what time the flight is going to take off? These are all the relevant decisions which somehow establish that who is really controlling the use of the asset. It does not matter who is operating the asset. Yeah? For instance, you can still have the operator or the airline operating the asset on your behalf. So auditors are more concerned about asking these simple questions. Everyone with me? At least I need to get some answer, right? Yes, no, maybe? Good. Okay, so as I said, yeah, protective rights are irrelevant in defining whether there is an identified asset or not. Protective rights are more to protect the physical somehow condition of the asset. Yeah, you cannot go off-road, you cannot land the aircraft in a war zone and these kind of things. Yeah, these are really protective rights. These do not define or do not hamper the criteria while establishing that who is really controlling the use of the asset. Yeah, so protective rights are somehow different than the rights to use the asset, yeah? Okay, so again, I think this is one of my favorite examples, yeah? Just take few minutes to read. Done? Sorry? Okay, so, okay, I can do that. Customer enters into contract with ship owner, okay, and there is a requirement to transport the cargo from Rotterdam to Sydney on a specified ship, identified asset. Ship is explicitly specified in the contract. Supplier does not have substitutive rights because it has only one ship. The cargo will occupy substantially all of the capacity of the ship. Okay. Contract specifies the cargo to be transported on the ship and the dates of pickup and delivery. Supplier operates and maintains the ship and is responsible for the safe passage of the cargo. Customer is prohibited from hiring another operator for the ship or operating the ship itself during the term of the contract. So what is your assessment? Is it a lease or not a lease? Who think that's a lease, please raise your hand. Who think it's not a lease? It's not a lease because customer rights are just comparable to any other customer who wants to ship the cargo on the same ship, yeah, because it's all written in the agreement. Because you remember in the decision tree we said if everything is predetermined, then you need to ask two further questions. One, is the customer operates the asset? In this case, no. Is the customer has designed the asset? Again, the answer is no. Ship was not designed by the customer, right? So his rights are just comparable to any normal customer. Although he has really hired the full ship to ship his cargo, but he cannot decide instead of going to Sydney, I want to go to some other port. Yeah? So as I said, in practical terms, these things can really be very complex. Very complex. I mean, I've spent 1 year on this project, so I can really tell you that, yeah. And many funny questions, yeah, from across the globe, yeah. So we were really sometimes, yeah, scratching our heads, yeah, what to do.
Excuse me, I have a question, please. Right. So, can you link this example up with the earlier concept of short-term lease? Would it? So, in the beginning, we discussed short-term lease, low-value assets, right? So, would it simply not fall under the short-term lease, if at all it's a lease, and then short-term lease?
Short-term leases, again, as I said, I'm not going to discuss short-term leases. Short-term leases, still IAS 17 is requirements are somehow applicable. Yeah, you can treat those as P&L expenses. You don't have to carry anything on the balance sheet.
Yeah, but would it really take more than 12 months to transport the cargo from one place to the other?
It is up to 1 year. That's a short-term lease. It's more than 1 year, surely. Yes. The first thing, whenever you see a contract, first thing which I said in one of my beginning slides, yeah, if it's a short term, go for that exemption. That is the best thing to do. If not, see if it's a low value. If it's a low value, go for low value. Third thing, see if you can apply the portfolio approach. If you can apply portfolio approach, do that. If all these tests are failed, then you have to see whether you have to create a separate right of use asset for that particular contract or not. Yeah? Okay, so we just discussed what our